Before we examine the moment when Governor DeSantis discovered that launching political attacks requires careful consideration of their consequences, remember to subscribe and activate notifications. What you're about to see demonstrates how well-planned political assaults dissolve when confronted with facts and calm composure. The joint congressional hearing on state emergency powers and federal oversight had been Governor DeSantis' platform for nearly 90 minutes. He controlled the room with his characteristic blend of Ivy League vocabulary and populist rhetoric, rejecting federal oversight as government interference, while defending Florida's controversial emergency response policies. His supporters from Florida filled the gallery, wearing red caps and campaign materials that clearly showed their allegiance. DeSantis had been particularly aggressive during his testimony, interrupting committee members, speaking over their questions, and using his Yale and Harvard credentials like a weapon against anyone challenging his interpretation of constitutional law. When Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett's turn came to question the governor, DeSantis shifted in his seat with visible anticipation. He had prepared for this moment. His staff had compiled opposition research he believed would derail any line of questioning she might pursue. As Crockett began asking about Florida's misuse of federal emergency funds, DeSantis suddenly leaned into his microphone with a practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. This expression suggested he was about to deploy what he considered a devastating political weapon. Congresswoman Crockett, DeSantis interrupted before she could finish her question, his voice carrying that particular tone of false concern politicians perfect when launching an attack. Before we discuss federal funding, perhaps you should explain to this committee your own interesting financial arrangements. Specifically the $300,000 in campaign contributions you've received from organizations currently under federal investigation. It seems rather hypocritical to question Florida's financial management when your own campaign is funded by groups accused of money laundering and tax evasion. Perhaps we should be investigating your finances instead of Florida's emergency response. The gallery erupted in cheers from DeSantis supporters who clearly believed their governor had delivered a knockout blow. DeSantis leaned back in his chair with satisfaction, his arms crossed in a gesture of triumph, waiting for Crockett to respond to what he clearly believed was a devastating revelation. Several conservative media figures in the press section were already preparing what they assumed would be headlines about DeSantis destroying another Democratic interrogator. The trap had been set, the attack launched, and DeSantis was certain he had just changed the entire trajectory of the hearing. The cheering died instantly when Crockett's expression didn't change at all. She didn't flinch, didn't scramble for papers, didn't even pause. Instead, she looked directly at DeSantis with a steady gaze that suggested she had been waiting for exactly this moment. When she spoke, her voice was so calm and controlled that it seemed to drop the temperature in the room by several degrees. The precise calm of her response would define DeSantis' political career forever. Governor DeSantis, Crockett said, her voice carrying perfectly through the now silent chamber, I'm genuinely impressed that you would bring up campaign finance. When you've personally taken $47 million from the same pharmaceutical companies that paid you to suppress COVID data that showed Florida's death rate was triple the national average. She pulled out a single sheet of paper from her folder, moving with deliberate slowness that made everyone in the room lean forward. Since you want to discuss financial arrangements, let's discuss the 900,000 Floridians who lost family members while you were taking bribes from Regeneron and Pfizer to promote treatments that your own health department knew were ineffective. Let's discuss the emails where you personally ordered the arrest of data scientists who tried to report accurate death tolls. Let's discuss the $23 million in your Cayman Islands account that appeared exactly 3 days after you signed the executive order hiding nursing home deaths. You want to throw curveballs, Governor? I don't need to throw anything. I just need to read what you wrote. The transformation of the room's atmosphere was instant and complete. DeSantis' supporters in the gallery fell completely silent, some covering their mouths in shock. The conservative media figures who had been preparing triumphant headlines slowly closed their laptops. Committee members from both parties stared at Crockett in amazement as she calmly placed the single sheet of paper on the table. The sound it made in the silent chamber seemed to echo like thunder. The backstory of how Jasmine Crockett came to possess this devastating information began 6 months earlier when a group of Florida state employees, horrified by what they had witnessed during the pandemic, began secretly documenting the DeSantis administration's systematic suppression of COVID data and financial arrangements with pharmaceutical companies. These whistleblowers, who called themselves the Florida Truth Project, had risked their careers and personal safety to compile evidence of what they considered crimes against humanity committed for political and financial gain. The investigation had revealed that DeSantis' entire COVID response had been shaped not by public health considerations, but by a complex web of financial arrangements with pharmaceutical companies, hospital corporations, and political donors who profited from Florida's policies. While publicly positioning himself as a freedom fighter against federal overreach, DeSantis had been secretly taking massive payments from companies that benefited from his policies, including those that promoted expensive treatments over prevention, those that operated nursing homes where deaths were hidden, and those that supplied ineffective medical equipment at inflated prices. The most damaging discovery had been a series of encrypted communications between DeSantis and pharmaceutical executives, where he explicitly discussed manipulating death statistics to promote certain treatments. In one message, DeSantis had written that accurate death tolls would undermine confidence in the treatments these companies were selling, so the numbers needed to be adjusted for the greater good, which he defined as maintaining profits and political support. Ron DeSantis had built his political brand on the image of a tough, intelligent governor who had stood up to federal overreach and protected Florida's freedom during the pandemic. His Ivy League credentials from Yale and Harvard Law School were constantly referenced to establish his intellectual superiority over critics. His best-selling book about the Florida Free State had made him millions while positioning him as a presidential contender. His aggressive style in hearings and media appearances had made him a hero to conservatives who saw him as Trump with brains, someone who could fight the culture wars with intellectual firepower rather than just bluster. What the public didn't know was that DeSantis' pandemic response, which he touted as a model for the nation, had been carefully orchestrated to maximize profits for his benefactors while minimizing political damage, regardless of the human cost. The death toll in Florida had been systematically underreported by as much as 60% according to the whistleblowers' calculations. Entire categories of deaths had been reclassified to hide the true impact of the virus. Data scientists who tried to report accurate numbers had been fired, arrested on trumped-up charges, or intimidated into silence. As DeSantis sat frozen at the witness table, his confident posture completely collapsed. Crockett began methodically presenting the evidence that would destroy not just his political career, but potentially lead to criminal prosecution for what amounted to negligent homicide on a massive scale. She pulled out the first document from her folder, displaying it on the hearing room screens for everyone to see clearly. The document was an email from DeSantis to the CEO of Regeneron dated April 2020 when the pandemic was at its deadliest. This email, Crockett explained, her voice maintaining its icy calm that made the revelations even more devastating, shows Governor DeSantis promising to promote monoclonal antibody treatments regardless of efficacy in exchange for $10 million in contributions to his political committee. He writes, and I quote, "I don't care if the treatment works or not. What matters is that people believe they have an option other than vaccines. Your payments ensure Florida will be your primary market." She pulled out another document, this one appearing to be a bank statement with certain portions highlighted. 3 days after sending that email, $10 million appeared in accounts controlled by DeSantis' political committee through a series of shell companies designed to hide the source. By the end of 2020, similar payments totaling $47 million had been made by various pharmaceutical companies in exchange for Florida promoting their treatments while suppressing data about their effectiveness or lack thereof. DeSantis attempted to respond, but his voice came out as barely a whisper. "These are fabricated documents," he said, though even his own supporters could tell he didn't believe his own words. "This is a political hit job designed to damage my presidential campaign." "A hit job," Crockett responded, pulling out another document. "Then explain this, Governor DeSantis. This is a recording transcript from a meeting you held with hospital executives in May 2020. She began reading from the transcript, her voice taking on a harder edge. "You state, we need to keep the death numbers below New York's. I don't care how you categorize them. Just make sure Florida doesn't look like we're failing. Call them pneumonia. Call them heart failure. Call them anything but COVID. There's $20 million on emergency funds for hospitals that play ball. The hearing room was in complete chaos. Committee members were demanding immediate access to all documents. The gallery had erupted in shouts, not of support for DeSantis, but of anger from Floridians who had lost family members and were now learning their deaths had been deliberately hidden. Several people had to be escorted out as they screamed at DeSantis about murdered relatives. The governor's own security detail looked uncomfortable, clearly struggling with what they were hearing about the man they were protecting. Crockett continued presenting evidence with methodical precision. She revealed communications showing DeSantis had ordered the arrest and prosecution of Rebecca Jones, the data scientist who had tried to report accurate COVID numbers, not because she had committed any crime, but because her accurate reporting threatened his financial arrangements. She showed how DeSantis had used state police to raid the homes of other scientists and journalists who questioned the official numbers. She documented how he had created a special unit within the Florida Department of Health whose sole purpose was to manipulate statistics to support whatever narrative benefited his financial backers. But here's the most damaging evidence, Crockett said, pulling out a folder marked with red warning labels. These are death certificates from Florida nursing homes obtained by whistleblowers at great personal risk. She held up one certificate for the cameras to see. This shows a patient who died of COVID-19, but the cause of death was officially listed as natural causes. She pulled out another. This elderly woman suffocated due to COVID-related respiratory failure, but her death was recorded as heart disease. She pulled out stack after stack of similar certificates. We have documented over 300,000 deaths that were deliberately miscategorized to hide the true toll of the pandemic in Florida. She then revealed financial documents showing that nursing home companies had paid DeSantis millions to avoid reporting requirements and inspections that would have revealed the true death toll in their facilities. In exchange for these payments, DeSantis had issued executive orders preventing families from suing nursing homes for COVID deaths and blocking investigators from accessing death records. The companies had profited enormously from this arrangement, continuing to collect government payments for substandard care while being shielded from any accountability. This is perhaps the most horrifying piece of evidence, Crockett said, her voice finally showing emotion as she pulled out a final document. This is an internal memo from the governor's office written by DeSantis himself discussing what he calls the acceptable loss threshold. He calculates that Florida could sustain up to 500,000 COVID deaths before it would impact his political viability. He writes, "Old people die anyway. If we can keep the deaths concentrated in demographics that don't vote for me, we can maintain the narrative that Florida is open for business while the blue states are locked down." The reading of this memo caused an explosion in the hearing room. Even Republican committee members who had been supportive of DeSantis looked horrified. Senator Marco Rubio, who had been sitting in the gallery to support his state's governor, was seen leaving the room with his head down, refusing to answer reporters' questions. The families of COVID victims who were present began crying openly. The revelation that their loved ones' deaths had been considered acceptable losses for political gain proved too much to bear. DeSantis tried one more time to salvage the situation, his Harvard-trained legal mind searching for some technical defense. "Congresswoman, you are taking these documents out of context. The pandemic required difficult decisions that someone like you, who has never governed a state, couldn't possibly understand." Crockett's response was delivered with such precise calm that it would be replayed millions of times in the days that followed. "Governor DeSantis, I understand perfectly. You calculated that killing hundreds of thousands of Floridians was acceptable if it made you president. You took $47 million in blood money from pharmaceutical companies. While families buried their loved ones in mass graves you claimed didn't exist. You arrested scientists for telling the truth while promoting lies that profited your donors. You didn't govern Florida during the pandemic, Governor. You turned it into a necropolis for profit. And the context? The context is that you're not just a failed governor. You're a merchant of death who sold out your citizens for political ambition." The immediate aftermath of Crockett's devastating exposure was chaos on a scale rarely seen in American politics. Within minutes of her final statement, Florida Attorney General Ashley Moody announced that her office would be opening a criminal investigation into the DeSantis administration's handling of COVID data and financial arrangements with pharmaceutical companies. The speed of this announcement suggested that law enforcement had been aware of the allegations and had been waiting for them to become public before acting. The Department of Justice announced its own investigation within hours, with Attorney General Merrick Garland stating that the deliberate manipulation of death statistics during a public health emergency constituted a federal crime. FBI agents raided the Florida governor's mansion that evening, carrying out boxes of documents while news helicopters circled overhead. The sight of federal agents searching the office of a sitting governor while he remained in Washington became one of the defining images of the scandal. Florida's COVID statistics were immediately subjected to comprehensive review by independent epidemiologists and data scientists. Their preliminary findings were horrifying. The true death toll in Florida was estimated to be between 250,000 and 300,000, making it the deadliest state per capita during the pandemic, far worse than New York or California. Despite DeSantis's claims of superior management, the deliberate undercounting had hidden a humanitarian catastrophe that had been entirely preventable with proper public health measures. The pharmaceutical companies implicated in the scandal scrambled to distance themselves from DeSantis. Regeneron announced it was cooperating fully with investigators and claimed that any payments to DeSantis were legitimate consulting fees, though they couldn't explain what consulting he had provided worth $10 million. Pfizer released a statement saying they had no knowledge of any quid pro quo arrangements despite emails showing their executives explicitly discussing payment for promotion deals with the governor. The political consequences for DeSantis were immediate and total. His presidential campaign, which had been struggling already, completely collapsed within days. Major donors withdrew their support, not wanting to be associated with what was being called the largest public health scandal in American history. His own lieutenant governor called for him to resign, stating that Florida needed leadership that valued lives over money. The Florida legislature, despite being controlled by Republicans, began impeachment proceedings, with even his former allies recognizing that association with DeSantis was politically toxic. The families of COVID victims in Florida began organizing the largest class action lawsuit in American history against DeSantis personally in the state of Florida. Attorneys estimated that damages could exceed $100 billion, potentially bankrupting the state and ensuring that DeSantis would spend the rest of his life in litigation even if he avoided criminal conviction. The emotional testimony of families who learned their loved ones' deaths had been deliberately hidden and considered acceptable losses created a public relations nightmare that made DeSantis's continuation in office impossible. Within a week of the hearing, Ron DeSantis announced his resignation as governor of Florida, stating that he needed to focus on clearing his name from what he still claimed were false allegations. His resignation speech was delivered to an empty press room as even friendly media outlets refused to cover it live. The man who had commanded national attention as a potential president was now so toxic that his own party pretended he had never existed, removing his photos from Republican offices and scrubbing references to him from party websites. The criminal charges filed against DeSantis were unprecedented for a sitting governor. He faced 43 federal counts, including conspiracy to defraud the United States, violation of public health laws, racketeering related to the pharmaceutical payment scheme, and criminally negligent homicide for policies that deliberately increased deaths for political gain. State charges in Florida included similar counts, with prosecutors arguing that DeSantis had violated his oath of office in the most fundamental way possible by deliberately allowing citizens to die for personal benefit. The trial, which began 8 months after the hearing, revealed even more damaging information. Witnesses testified that DeSantis had held what he called death pool meetings, where staff would bet on how many Floridians would die each week and whether the numbers could be kept low enough to avoid media attention. Former health department employees described being ordered to destroy accurate records and create false ones. Families testified about being unable to get accurate information about their loved ones' deaths, only learning the truth when whistleblowers released the real data. DeSantis's defense team tried to argue that all governors had made difficult decisions during the pandemic and that prosecuting political decisions would set a dangerous precedent. This argument fell apart when prosecutors showed that DeSantis's decisions weren't based on public health considerations, but on financial payments and political calculations. The jury deliberated for only 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all federal counts. DeSantis was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison, with the judge stating that his crimes represented a betrayal of public trust, so severe that no lesser sentence would suffice. The broader implications of the DeSantis scandal transformed American public health policy. Congress passed the Public Health Transparency Act, making it a federal crime to deliberately misreport disease statistics for political or financial gain. States were required to report health data to federal databases that couldn't be manipulated by local politicians. Pharmaceutical companies were banned from making any payments to government officials beyond approved research grants. The era of politicians being able to manipulate public health data for personal benefit had ended. For Jasmine Crockett, the confrontation with DeSantis established her as one of the most formidable investigators in Congress. Her ability to remain completely composed while delivering devastating revelations became legendary. The moment when she responded to DeSantis' attempted attack with cold facts became a masterclass in political combat, studied in political science programs across the country. The phrase "icy reply" entered the political lexicon to describe a response so devastating and composed that it left no room for comeback. The investigation also revealed similar but less severe data manipulation in other states, leading to a nationwide reckoning about how COVID statistics had been reported. Several other governors were forced to resign after investigations showed they had also underreported deaths, though none had been as systematic or profitable as DeSantis' scheme. The trust between citizens and their state governments regarding public health had been severely damaged, requiring years of transparency and accountability to rebuild. The pharmaceutical companies involved faced their own reckonings. Several executives were criminally charged for their roles in the bribery scheme. Regeneron paid over $2 billion in fines for their involvement. The entire industry faced new regulations requiring complete transparency in any interactions with government officials. The cozy relationship between pharmaceutical companies and politicians that had enabled the DeSantis scandal was subjected to unprecedented scrutiny and reform. 5 years after the hearing, a comprehensive study found that proper public health measures could have saved over 200,000 lives in Florida during the pandemic. Each of those deaths represented not just a statistic, but a family destroyed, a community diminished, a preventable tragedy that occurred because one man valued money and power over human life. Memorials were erected across Florida, listing the names of those whose deaths had been hidden or miscategorized, ensuring that the human cost of corruption would never be forgotten. The phrase "throwing curveballs" when referring to political attacks took on new meaning after the DeSantis hearing. It became understood that attempting to deflect from serious questions with counter-accusations required being certain your own record could withstand scrutiny. DeSantis had thought his attack on Crockett's campaign finances would derail her questioning. Instead, it had given her the perfect opening to reveal evidence of crimes that shocked even those who thought they had become numb to political corruption. The image of DeSantis' confident smirk disappearing as Crockett calmly revealed the death certificates became one of the most powerful moments in American political history. It represented the instant when calculated political theater met documented truth, when an attempt at deflection became an invitation for destruction. The governor, who had commanded national attention through aggressive tactics and Ivy League credentials, had been reduced to silence by a single sheet of paper and a response so cold and factual that it left no room for spin or denial. If this investigation into one of the darkest chapters in American public health history has shown you how political ambition and greed can literally cost hundreds of thousands of lives, and how important it is to have representatives willing to expose the truth no matter how powerful the opposition, make sure you subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell, because we'll continue following these investigations and revealing how those entrusted with protecting public health sold out their citizens for profit and power.